Before we leave Ephesus, we need to talk about some of the slaves who worked in the Temple of Artemis. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. It took 120 years of construction to complete. It was 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Rome. The temple was about 340 feet by 160 feet, and it sat on a platform that was about 425 by 240 feet. It had 127 columns that were 60 feet tall and 6 feet thick. 36 of these columns were covered in sculptures and overlaid with gold. As you sailed into the port of Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis would have absolutely dominated the skyline. It would have immediately signaled the wealth and prominence of the city. And as all major temples were benefices of the emperor, it would have been a sign of imperial power and favor that had been bestowed on Ephesus. Archaeologists have found a series of inscriptions in Ephesus which shed some light on how the temple functioned and which also demonstrate that the Temple of Artemis functioned like any other Roman temple in the empire. The inscriptions tell us about 2 principal positions: the Pertinaeus and the Hierophant. The Pertinaeus was elected from the wealthy ruling class to function as the chief priest of the temple for the year. Their duties included maintaining the sacred fire which perpetually burned in the temple hearth, the entertaining of visiting dignitaries, and the oversight and execution of the daily public sacrifices and yearly festivals. The Pertinaeus wasn't elected based on their holiness, their prayerfulness, their public speaking ability, or their detailed knowledge of the day-to-day operations of a sacrificial temple. They were elected based on their ability to pay a large amount of money, which would go towards the temple's operating costs. What would the Pertinaeus get out of the deal? Well, prestige and power, of course. Lists of the yearly Pertinaeuses from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD show that they tended to come from the same prominent Ephesian families throughout the generations. However, while the Pertinaeus was the public face of the temple, the priestly knowledge didn't rest with them. Remember, they weren't elected because they knew what they were doing. The keeper of the body of sacerdotal knowledge, ritual practices, and basic temple operations rested with the Hierophant and the permanent temple staff who worked under him. From the inscription found at Ephesus, the public Hierophant leads the Pertinaeus around and teaches him in what manner each thing is customary to the gods, that they should sing hymns at the sacrifices and at the processions and at all the night festivals. Also, if the Pertinaeus did something wrong, left something out, had a public failure, they were subject to punishment and fine levied by the Hierophant. In other words, this Hierophant was the real official power holder in the temple. The Pertinaeus may have had all the glory and prestige and wealth, but they weren't just there to look good. They were there to function properly as they were trained by the Hierophant, and they were held to account by the Hierophant if their service was found to be lacking. Okay, here's the thing though. Just like there were lists of the Pertinaeuses, there were also lists made of the Hierophants and the staff that worked under him. And those lists include a lot of slave names, which means that the prominent and wealthy Pertinaeuses who had paid good money for their position, by taking that position, they were subject to working directly with slaves, were being trained in their duties by slaves, and were being overseen, corrected, and potentially punished by a slave. There is no corollary to this situation in the slavery that we are familiar with in the American South. Not only do these Ephesian inscriptions line up with what we know of temple practice in other parts of the Roman Empire, not only do these inscriptions show enslaved persons in positions of power over and above the ruling class of the city, but they also show that slaves could function in the center of the religious life of the empire. As strange and perverse as Roman paganism is found to be, they did take their religion seriously. They certainly believed that keeping the gods happy and sated was of the utmost importance to the preservation of the empire. They weren't just making things up as they went along. Rather, there was a long and detailed sacerdotal history and set of practices which were learned, honed, and executed. And yet, they were comfortable with putting this important, delicate, and sacred tradition into the hands of slaves. When St. Paul came to Ephesus to preach the gospel, this is what the Temple of Artemis was doing. This was how it functioned. This incredibly impressive facade was what greeted Paul on his entrance into the city. And when Paul left Ephesus to plant other churches, this is the environment that the Ephesian church grew up in. As our inquiry into slavery in the New Testament deepens, we'll come back to this, and I think it will help us marvel at the ubiquitous presence of slaves in early Christianity. Slaves made up a key demographic in the early Christian communities. They were well known by the leadership, and they held leadership positions within the church. This was allowed and celebrated in the early Gentile churches, partly, of course, because of the teachings of Jesus, the insistence of the Torah that all people are created in the image of God. But also, of course, because the first Gentile Christians who grew up not as Jews but as pagans had always seen slaves occupy roles of tremendous religious importance. They had changed religions, of course, but one of the things that they carried from paganism to Christianity was the understanding that one's position as slave didn't prevent them from leading prayer, from making offerings, and organizing the community around sacred precepts.